Welcome to the Futurist Society podcast, where we delve into the latest advancements in technology, science, and culture. From discussions on the latest breakthroughs in AI, biotechnology, and space exploration, the Futurist Society is your window into all of the awesomeness that the future holds. Get ready to be informed and inspired as we consider the positive impact of emerging technologies on humanity. Without further ado, welcome your host, Dr. Awesome.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Futurist Society. We are broadcasting from the present and talking about the future. Today, I have Dr. Tanisha Hill-Jarrett. She's a neuropsychologist and expert in the intersection between racism and how it affects your health. So welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this?
Sure. My name's Tanisha Hill-Jarrett. I'm a neuropsychologist and transitioning to an assistant professor position at the University of California, San Francisco. I'm interested in all things related to Black women's wellness, in particular factors that impact their cognitive aging and how they can live long, healthy lives. And I'm personally interested in it as a Black woman. I come from a Black woman and a family of Black women. And so these topics are really near and dear to my heart. And I'm also largely interested in it because I know that Black women are at high risk for neurodegenerative diseases. And so I'm interested in looking at the factors that impact that risk, but also promote resilience and allow Black women to live well.
Cool. So racism is a tough topic. And so I just want to put it as a caveat. If I say anything that's inappropriate, I totally apologize to the internet. And I hope that, everything is done with grace and fluidity. But I'm a human being, and I hope that we can talk about things in a free and open manner. So first off, I did want to talk with you and ask you specifically about how does racism affect someone's health? Because it's something that, I learned about a little bit in medical school, but just tangentially, right? Like pulse oximeters were really made, and that's how you measure blood oxygen level for people who don't know. They were originally made for fair skin types, so they're not as accurate. There's certain medications that have different effects with different races, but just from a more broader perspective, and then certainly also a more specific perspective with neurodegenerative disease, what are some things that you're seeing that affect a person's health and also have an intersection with the race that they're associated with?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to zoom out and look at the different levels of racism. So racism can impact people systemically or at the macro level. There's the meso level, there's the micro level, which is more interpersonal experiences of racism. I focus primarily on the macro, so systemic as well as interpersonal, so person-to-person contact and experiences of racism. At the macro level, what we talk about are the social determinants of health, which are the places that people live in, where they work, where they grow up, and how that really sets them on a particular trajectory for wellness and health or for illness. And what we see is that when we look at the macro or the systemic issues, there's systems and policies in place that influence where people, certain people, right, based on race and ethnicity, what they have access to, the types of jobs that they work in, the neighborhoods that they live in, and this in turn influences their health. And so one really good example of this is looking at residential segregation based off of redlining and the policies that influenced where people were able to live. And for instance, that may influence access to like green space, that may influence access to where you have grocery stores. So some people may live in like food deserts, et cetera. So really the policies at the policy level trickles down to influence a person's kind of lived experience in the environment. And that may influence what they have access to and in turn their health at a larger scale. And then of course you have personal experiences where people are actors or the enactors of racism. That also is a certain type of stressor. And we know that the stress has a negative impact on the body, and in particular, the brain. Chronic stress, so stress over time, impacts the hippocampus. And we know that people who experience either repeated stressors or chronic stressors actually experience atrophy, so shrinkage of the hippocampus. And that's a region that's really critical for memory. And so people with Alzheimer's disease in particular experience atrophy and changes in their hippocampus over time. So there's a number of linkages, so related to structural issues as well as just interpersonal day-to-day experiences of racism.
So let's talk a little bit about the micro level first before we zoom out again. When you're talking about neurodegenerative disease, do you find a higher incidence of this kind of stuff in different racial groups or different demographics?
Right. Absolutely. Yes. So what we know currently in the literature is that African Americans are about 1.5 to 2 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. So that's also including like vascular dementias. And we also know that Latinx people of Latino backgrounds also are at higher risk as well. So compared to white Americans.
So is that because of physiology, or like, what do you attribute that to?
Right. So there's a lot of research going on to understand how the biology interacts with the environment. And initially, people thought it was related to just ApoE4. So people who have the ApoE4 allele and white Americans have an exponentially higher risk.
So for those who aren't familiar, that's a gene, correct? That codes for, I think it's for lipoprotein, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. I mean, you're really like dusting off some old cobwebs in my brain right now. This is not my area of expertise. I just wanted to make sure other people were familiar with that. So anyway, so they thought it was initially, I didn't mean to cut you off. They thought it initially was because of this gene, correct?
Right. And so in white Americans, we see that there's a higher risk, but a lot of the research studies, this also relates to racism as well in science. A lot of the research studies have been focused on primarily white samples. And so a lot of what we know about Alzheimer's disease, the risk factors, et cetera, are largely linked to our understanding of aging white adults. And so initially the thought was that this ApoE4 increased risk for Alzheimer's disease, which it does for a subset of people, but how it relates to other populations, we're still trying to figure that out. And so my point is that it's not exclusively linked to biology, because it does, ApoE4 allele doesn't operate in the same way in other populations. And what we're seeing is that it's really the interaction of our biology with the environment, and our lived experiences, as well as, the ways that we're taking care of ourselves and our overall health and how we maintain our health over time, that sets us up on this trajectory to develop neurodegenerative diseases.
So it's multifactorial, and physiology might not be the only smoking gun that connects this. What are some social contributors that you found in your research?
Right. So one of the things is education. So education is really, really critical. And it's thought there's this concept called cognitive reserve. And so the initial thought was that the more education, the higher education you have, the more resistant you are to the abnormalities that happen in the brain that contribute to Alzheimer's disease. So accumulation of beta amyloid and tau. But what research by Jennifer Manley, who's a neuropsychologist at Columbia, she showed it's not necessarily the quantity or the number of years of education. It's really about the quality of education that a person has. And the reason that that's really important is when you think historically in the United States, and just even present day, there's differences in the quality of education. And when we think historically, Black Americans in the South in particular lived in segregation. And so they went to segregated schools, which also impacted the quality of the education that they experienced. And for that reason, you can have a person, for instance, that has a high school education, but that doesn't equate maybe to the same high school education out west or up north. And so for that reason, their buffer or their ability to withstand the abnormalities that are developing in the brain is less. So they may experience the onset of neurodegenerative disease. Like your ability to withstand the pathology actually is not the same. It's actually less. And so your onset of symptoms may occur sooner. So you can have two people that have a high school education, both have the same amount of beta amyloid in their brain, but one person may not manifest those clinical symptoms of a neurodegenerative disease. And we think that's because the way reserve operates is based on actual quality of education, quality of experiences that you've had throughout your life.
I want to get back to that. As you were talking about the beta amyloid, I heard about this and I don't know if this is like a real thing, but you're in the field. So I feel like I wanted to ask you specifically about it. Have you heard about this controversy with the gentleman that did a lot of research with Alzheimer, and a lot of it is now found to be just like not accurate?
Yes. I read at Stanford. Is that what you're talking about?
Something like that. Yeah. About like how amyloid was not the smoking gun that it was. I found like specifically for Alzheimer's, there was a certain amount of research that is like foundational research that has been found to be not accurate or potentially fabricated. I'm not sure, but I know you're in the field, so I wanted to ask you specifically about that.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I feel like there's a camp of people that think it's really the beta amyloid. And I think there's a camp of people that also think it's tau that is really, both happen, right? Both happen. And people experience changes in both of those proteins, and that contributes to neurodegenerative disease. But it's a question of which one is kind of the thing that's really the impetus, and what should we really be focusing on. And in regards to that particular person, to be honest, I didn't read their papers, but I did hear about the controversy. And my understanding is that I guess somebody reviewed it and said that they didn't fabricate the research, but they were kind of negligent in how they like oversaw it. So they weren't really involved in manipulating the data. Now, not sure. I don't know if that's true or not, or was that reviewed things, but it was a very controversial thing.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I feel like a lot of people have this, and you kind of alluded to it too. The current model of scientific research is just, it's not as clear cut as we once thought it was, not only just from a plagiarism or fabrication perspective, but I know a lot of people that are getting their research from the internet, that are, getting it from questionable sources. And also, just like what you alluded to, a lot of it is based on a certain demographic, like my background is in the head and neck, and anthropometric measurements of what we consider to be ideal are based on the white European model, right? And so, what I feel like what I'm talking about is that there's this larger kind of distrust with the scientific community that's out there right now. And I worry that it's not particularly helpful to people like you and me that are trying to get the word out for this kind of stuff. Are you getting some of that pushback with people that you interact with? Is that just is that something that maybe I'm just noticing and it might not be accurate?
I think what you're saying is accurate. And I want to speak, after I answer the question, I also kind of want to speak to the pressures of just being in academia in general and how that may contribute. But I do think that there's generally a medical mistrust and mistrust of the scientific community. And I'm speaking again from like an African-American perspective, given that that's my experience, but also the community that I work with. And I think that's also largely rooted in like medical racism and some of the stuff that you've mentioned, that a lot of what we know from science is rooted in Western European ways of knowing. And then also, if you think about like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, et cetera, there have been a number of ways in which science has mistreated people from the Black American community and exploited them. Or if you think about Henrietta Lacks and how they used her cells to make discovery, but they took her cells without her even knowing, like without her consent, essentially. And so I think things like that create this culture of mistrust. And it's really up to us as clinicians and researchers to bridge that gap and to rebuild trust with these communities.
So I feel like faith in institutions is like at an all-time low just in general. So I think that leads into my next topic, which is like, what are, as someone who's not familiar, what are the institutional contributors to poor health outcomes in disparate demographic, like in different races? And then also a follow-up question to that is that when you're talking about poor health outcomes, specifically in neurodegenerative diseases, can you talk a little bit more about some of your research and like how the social constructs have led to these issues?
Right. Yeah. So can you ask the question again? Sorry, the first part.
Yeah. So big picture, there's lack of faith in institutions, right?
Yep.
And there's, problems with that. And how does that affect different races, and just like you had talked about, like there's an inherent distrust within the African American community because of the Tuskegee experiments, because of Henrietta Lacks, which for those of you guys who don't know, it's like this woman who contributed cells to stem cell research and really has not gotten any sort of compensation, or these cell lines are keep on reproducing. Am I saying that correctly? Is that accurate?
Took them without her knowing.
Yeah.
So it wasn't even that she voluntarily came with, like, I think it may have been that they were doing a medical examination and they extracted that information, that data from her, and then used it to make scientific discoveries. And so, yeah.
So that is there. We know that it's there. What are the downstream effects of from a public health perspective, just in general, if you have any information about that? I know that's not specifically your area of interest, but I feel like that, but that's number one. Number two, are you seeing any of that specifically with neurodegenerative diseases?
Yeah, well, I can speak to that with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. What we know in certain racial and ethnic minority communities, in particular Black Americans, they oftentimes present clinically with symptoms of dementia way more advanced than other groups. So they have more severe cognitive impairments at the time that they're getting medical attention. And I think a lot of the narrative around that has been focused on, well, maybe Black Americans and these other minoritized groups aren't aware of the symptoms. That can be part of it. But the other larger issue that I think is now being more discussed is the fact that the system isn't acknowledging the symptoms. So in particular, when I think about like maternal health outcomes, right? When Black women are coming and presenting clinically and complaining of certain things or reporting specific symptoms, their symptoms aren't taken seriously. They're sent home, or they're not treated appropriately, and then they end up dying. Now, with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, I think that part of the issue is that there's kind of like gatekeeping. So oftentimes people are presenting to their PCPs and reporting symptoms, and it's really up to the PCP to refer them to a specialist. So either a neurologist, a neuropsychologist for follow-up evaluation, and those things, that pathway to actually getting the diagnosis and having any sort of intervention or psychosocial support isn't really happening. And so either they're not being referred, or sometimes people are presenting to the emergency room. That's the other thing that we're seeing a lot of times, is that these communities are receiving care in emergency room settings, and then that's kind of it. So there's no real like follow-up, there's no real continuity of care. And I think that that's also impacting how far along symptoms are developed when they're getting the care that they need, or if they get care at all.
So how much of this is based on race and how much of this is based on socioeconomic status? Because as a outsider looking in, I see people in the emergency room, and socioeconomic status is like a huge factor for us, like with all of the problems that you said. And, I feel like that cuts across races, and maybe your information might give us a different view of that.
Yeah, I think the two intersect. I think
Mhm.
SES, socioeconomic status, is absolutely important. I think it impacts access to insurance. It impacts whether you're receiving care at like a public hospital, what that looks like, the amount of time you have to wait to receive care, et cetera. So I think from an insurance standpoint, and maybe even quality of care or the type of care that you receive, I think that SES is important. But that also intersects with race, because at the end of the day, I think people have inherent biases. Clinicians have their own biases. And so you see a person's race. Like, I know people like to act like they're colorblind, or they don't see race, or they don't see color.
Mhm.
That's something that we see and that people respond to. And I think it's really up to medical providers and clinicians to be aware of that and to acknowledge it as a real thing. And knowing that, what are you doing with that information, or how are you, trying to combat these biases? And what does that mean for the type of care and the culturally competent care that you're providing to patients? But I absolutely think that like SES impacts a person's experience within the healthcare system, but it also intersects with the person's race.
Is there any objective data that you can highlight that might prove your point? Like, for example, given a person's socioeconomic status being equal between, let's say, somebody that's brown skin versus black skin versus white skinned, are the health outcomes worse in those different demographics respectively?
Yeah. I'm thinking of a study. Yeah, I don't know if they controlled for socioeconomic status or if they like matched people on that, but I'm thinking of a research study, and it was like recent, which is kind of scary, where they asked medical students to like rate people's pain tolerance, or what they're like assess a person's pain tolerance or something
Yeah,
like
I remember
that.
that study. Yeah.
And they thought that Black people had a higher pain tolerance. And these are people that are like medically trained, right? And so I don't know if they factored in SES into that, but I think that that's like a real world example of how race in medicine isn't always, I don't want to say it's not acknowledged, but it impacts people's medical decision making, unfortunately. So.
Yeah. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I feel like race is such such a tough topic because there's no real like good answers. Like I've read that study where people have like this inherent bias, but like, why does that exist? Like, I don't know why that exists. Do you know why that exists? I mean, like, why is there that inherent? Like, I grew up in a time where we had a black president, right? And like theoretically outcomes should be equal. But then there's a study recently that came out, just like you said, that says that objectively medical students were having a different set of symptoms based on race. So I want to feel like this is getting better. Is there any objective evidence to highlight that things are getting better, specifically from the intersection between race and health? Like, are health outcomes getting better in general for African Americans or for Latino Americans, or I feel like I feel like things must be.
I think that people are living longer. And so because I study neurodegenerative disease, like our society is aging, we're an aging population. And with that, I think it gives us the opportunity to study these conditions and how they disproportionately impact people. And so while people are living longer, we see that certain groups of people are more afflicted with conditions, right? And I think it goes back to my original point that it's not solely related to how well you care for yourself or even genetics. It really has to do with the environment. And I think, to speak to your point, I don't know that like I don't want to sound negative about everything because I do have a certain level of optimism. And I think that that's rooted in the fact that we need to make policy level changes. I think that there's changes in policies that trickle down, like that macro level, that can have kind of this trickle down filtered effect. But until then, I don't know that we're going to see huge strides.
Yeah. So I don't know if you've been following the news, but like the congressional meeting on UFOs just happened a few
Really?
yeah, so a few days ago. They had these people that sat down and basically gave their evidence for why they think that UFOs are a big thing. And that's something in science fiction that has been very much a monumental shift in humanity's thought process. Like once we realize that there's another species that's also intelligent, then we're going to look at each other and be like, we're the same species, right? Like, why are we fighting against each other?
Right.
So I agree with you. There has to be some sort of monumental shift. I don't know what that is, but I mean, I think that health outcomes must be getting better, but there's still a ways to go. I don't know if there's any particular evidence on that because it's not something that I follow, but I hope that they're going in the right direction. What gives you like some sort of hope, because I feel like, it's very difficult to see this information, especially being a Black woman yourself and seeing all of these things that you have to go through that other people may not have to do. Is there anything that gives you hope that like, okay, things might turn out okay?
I think that, in spite of all the things that we've discussed and racism, issues with the healthcare system, et cetera, there are people that are still living well. So it's not to mean like, it's all doom and gloom for everybody. I think that there are people that are thriving. There are people that are still living long, meaningful lives, that have families, that have, a sense of purpose, and are able to kind of, I don't want to say they insulate themselves from all the stuff, but I think that they're still able to have meaning and to thrive. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Thomas Sowell, the African American writer at all? No. So he was a gentleman. I think he was from California, but he was very focused on the cultural contribution to poor outcomes for African Americans versus everyone else. So, for example, like you take somebody that is African American that has been raised here in the United States, let's say in Mississippi or Alabama, and then you compare those outcomes of achievement to like an immigrant population, like somebody who came from the West Indies, and the West Indies families or groups tended to outperform the people who were born or like multiple generations here in America. And so his idea, and again, like I'm not an expert in this, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it, is that the cultural contributions of these poor outcomes were significant enough to be addressed, right? Like the cultural contribution of a distrust of the education system was enough that provided poor outcomes for this population versus that population, whereas opposed to in the West Indies population, they had this idea of like prizing education. And that's when you have like these high achieving African Americans in that specific population. I don't know if that's something that you have personally felt, but it's something that is coming up specifically in regards to what I see on a regular basis, which is like, a difference in health choices, which is something that I see like on a regular basis. Like, for example, the choice in diet as opposed to, a lower socioeconomic status person versus a higher socioeconomic status person. A lower socioeconomic status person is most likely to have higher rates of obesity. They're more likely to smoke. They're more likely to do other things that contribute to poor health outcomes. What are your thoughts on that? Do you feel like that's a contributing factor, or do you feel like that is not accurate?
Well, I think what you're describing, and I'm not familiar with the person that you mentioned and his specific work, but
Mhm.
what my understanding of what you're describing is called the immigrant paradox. So the immigrant paradox, where people that immigrate to the United States, and my understanding is they may not even have the same level of resources, but their health outcomes are better than the minority communities here in the United States. Now,
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of research going on as to why and what that means, and
Mhm.
even what it means to lack resources in your home environment. But maybe, I don't know. Actually, I don't know. I don't know what the explanation behind that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But do you think that's a contributing factor? Like, do you think that culture is such that that's something that we should also focus on?
Culture and what? So you mean,
I
say that
think
again?
that there's certain aspects of culture that are negative that contribute to poor health outcomes.
Mm. You mean like health behaviors?
Hmm. Like, is that also a contributing factor for neurodegenerative disease? Like, for example, like,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
So I mean, I didn't. Okay. So health behaviors absolutely impacts a person's trajectory, and whether, I don't think it's like the end all be all, but it
Mhm.
contributes. Actually, there's a research study that shows 40% of dementia can be reduced through like these health behaviors and like these modifiable risk factors. So things like diet and exercise, sleep, um social stimulation versus being socially isolated. Are you engaging in like cognitively stimulating activities as well as like education? And so all of these things that we have to some degree influence over, um really does impact our cognitive aging trajectory and can reduce or increase our risk for dementia. So yes, but if you're asking whether or not that may differ across cultures, that's a good question.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that is a good question, and I'm sure there are people that look at that, and how that relates to being an immigrant.
Yeah.
I'm not as familiar with that literature. Yeah.
So my sister, who I was is also a physician, she sent me this article about specifically with like Indian Americans, like myself, that people from South Asia have higher rates of diabetes than the general population for whatever reason it is, and a lot of it is because this is like the article's premise is that the culture of eating a lot of carbs, right? Like rice is like our general go-to for any sort of meal, or like there are breads and stuff like that. But the fact is that it's usually a high carb meal,
Mhm.
and so there's this idea that that was ingrained in us
Oh,
for when we were under British rule, that there was like a lot of malnutrition or the reason for us to eat this like high carb meal. And then
mhm.
now you come into a time where that's not necessarily the case anymore, where we're not expending that amount of energy, and then therefore we get insulin resistance and diabetes. So the article's premise was that this is something that is part of our culture that we need to change. Like, we need to talk about why our food is so bad. And I feel like that's something that, like, I would hope that is more research comes out about, because so much of lifestyle factors, I think, are contributors to poor health, and we talk about them because, like, and it's so easy to say, Tanisha, you need to eat better, right?
Yeah.
But like, if you're going to, like, if I'm going to a like a family function and there's like a ton of great Indian food, like, I'm not gonna I'm not gonna choose a chicken breast and salad. It's just,
Mhm.
that's a cultural contributor that's setting me up for failure, in my opinion. And I don't know how much research is out there. I didn't know if there was anything specifically with neurodegenerative disease. I feel like, smoking is something that is a contributor to neurodegenerative disease. And, there's a certain amount of cultural influence to it, but I don't know if it's necessarily, is there any objective data about that? Because I know that there are certain cultures that are more predisposed to smoking than others, but I don't know what specifically with smoking. Is there any objective data about the influence of culture and the risk of that?
Can I go back? Because as you were talking about the diet piece, it made me think of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet.
Yeah.
That's something that's recommended
Yeah.
for brain health. So there's been a study that shows people in the Mediterranean have like a lower incidence of neurodegenerative disease. And
Hmm.
so eating fish, berries, nuts, etc. And following that particular diet plan actually may be beneficial for brain health over time. And
Hmm.
so that's one thing clinically that we tell people. It's called the Mediterranean diet. And then there's also the DASH diet. So yeah, I think that to your point, I didn't get what you were asking initially about the influence of culture, but yes, there I think are cultural specific factors in terms of like the diets that we eat, the activities that we do, that can influence risk for neurodegenerative disease. So absolutely.
Yeah, I just feel like there's no way that I'm going to be able to convince my grandmother to eat a Mediterranean diet. Like, it's just not going to happen. It's like she's going to eat Indian food until the day that she passes on. And like, that's something that is so significant to her. Like, she is just so used to living this way. And that's one of the things that I wish that there was more research on. Like, how do you convince somebody to live differently, even if it's like smoking, right? Like, there's so many smokers that I see and I diagnose with some sort of end stage health outcome that's poor, like cancer, and then they're still going to smoke afterwards. That's an interesting topic to me. I feel like with you, you're going more upstream, and seeing all of these different contributing factors from a bunch of different levels. But at the end of the day, like, it's up to the person, right? It's up to the person to change their lifestyle. But
Yeah. Well, you're making me think about, so like as a psychologist, I'm also very interested in like person level factors that influence
mhm.
like decision making essentially. And one of the things that I look at is coping, and what it sounds like to some degree, sometimes food is a form of coping for people. And I'm thinking in particular about the research study that I did. It was with Black women looking at the relationship between gendered racism and their report, just their subjective report of cognitive concerns, or the number of cognitive concerns that they actually may have. And what we found was that across the life course, so we had them rate their experiences of gendered racism, so cross-cutting racism as well as sexism across their life course. Those that reported higher rates of gendered racism had more cognitive concerns. And this relationship actually was explained through symptoms of depression. So depression was like a mediator of that relationship, and then coping style. So we looked at different coping styles among the women. We looked at like problem solving, so being focused on the problem and just kind of getting to the solution. We looked at disengagement, which actually is like denying that there is a problem, engaging in substance abuse to distance yourself from the problem. We looked at social support as a form of coping. And then, so disengagement, social support, problem solving. Oh, and then we looked at spirituality as a form of coping as well. So we looked at those four. And what we saw was that actually disengagement explained that relationship. So depression as well as disengagement among Black women explained the relationship between gendered racism and the number of cognitive complaints they had. And what we thought was that, why not spirituality? Why not these other like more positive forms of coping? Why disengagement? And what we think is that disengagement, unfortunately, is helpful in the short term with dealing with problems. It distances you from the issue at hand, but
Mhm.
like if you're in an environment that's stressful long term and you continuously engage in that pattern of behavior, then that's when it's going to have some sort of detrimental impact on you. And so to kind of bring it back to what you're saying, for some people, smoking, engaging in unhealthy eating habits may be a form of coping. And so I think that there's an important person level factor that contributes to this, as like cultural, but also like individual
Mhm.
choice in lived experiences as well. So
So when you mean disengagement, you mean just like they didn't talk to anybody, they didn't really
I
like
didn't talk
interact
to
with.
Yeah, they were like acting like it wasn't like, no, not everything's fine, like not opening up to share, hey, these are bad things that are happening to me. Or
Mm-hmm.
so it was a questionnaire that they filled out. And some of the questions also asked about like substance abuse, using alcohol. I think smoking may have been on there, but that also is a form of disengaging from the problem to escape whatever your reality is in that moment. And so
Mm-hmm.
what we found was that for those people, more gendered racism was associated with higher levels of disengagement. And that
Mm.
in turn predicted a higher number of cognitive complaints.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's interesting because, I am particularly interested in how the social fabric of our country is changing. And honestly, the world is changing, with the advent of the internet and social media. We're dealing with a lot of different social environments that we weren't necessarily equipped to handle. I think that I was talking with a anthropologist on the podcast the other day, and he was saying that we at the height of our capacity for human beings was during like the Stone Age. That was like what we were when we were like the healthiest, we were the largest, and all this stuff. And I feel like so much of our evolution was based to survive in that. And we're now like we're being bombarded with all these new things that, we're not necessarily evolved to handle. And the family structure that we have, the social structure that we have are so important for so many different reasons. And we don't even realize that. And something like what you're saying, like it might be more difficult for these people to handle the stresses of racism, but also just the stresses in general. Like that's when the your family is so important, and it's becoming less important, I think, as the internet and social media becomes such a prevailing presence. But I did talk with it, just to not be super pessimistic about it. I did talk with a guy who is also a sociologist, and he's saying now we're coming full circle, and that now the internet is providing a certain amount of opportunity for us to get to know people that we otherwise would not get to know. And so we're kind of reforming our society into like our own little communities on the internet, which is kind of cool, that you have the ability to, like, if I'm really into anime or something like that, I can find my own little niche of people that only talk about anime. And that becomes a safety net for me socially that I might not have had access to through my family or through my community.
Thinking, like, to your point about, I think the positive impact, because really the internet and social media, it can help or it can hurt. And it's really about you using it intentionally, like having intentionality behind how you use it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think its purpose was really highlighted during the pandemic when a lot of people were socially isolated and we weren't able to go outside and see people that we frequently have contact with. And so I think the internet gave us the opportunities to still experience some form of connection and some form of relating to people and having those shared experiences. Is it a replacement for in-person interaction? Of course not. But I think that it can be utilized in ways that are helpful. It absolutely can. And it can be used as a form of a social connector as well.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking, you're halfway across the country and I'm able to, gain some insight from this topic that I really am not an expert in. And so, I think that's a profound benefit. And I think that personally, as technology becomes more significant, and now, especially with augmented reality, virtual reality, I hope that it just increases the social bonds that we have as a society. But anyway, this was great. I really enjoyed talking with you. We are getting to the end of our time. So I always try to follow up with 3 questions that, like, as we're talking, I would like to expand more upon, but I don't want to contribute to the end of the conversation. So I did want to ask you, for me, one of the things that I always ask all my guests is, where do you get your inspiration from? For me, it's science fiction. When I look at the amazing things that the future holds, like, I can't wait till I have like a robot butler or flying cars or any of this cool stuff that I hope is coming down the pipeline. But what do you gain inspiration from? Is any sort of media, books, movies, anything like that?
I get inspo from art, and I get inspo from Afrofuturism, which is a form of art. And yes, I
I
love
wish that we would have talked about that.
I
Okay.
know.
Can we talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Some of the
Tell
work
me a
that
little
I'm
bit. So
doing.
I didn't even know. So like the only introduction that I have to Afrofuturism was like through the Black Panther movies, which is like this idealized version of one type of African experience. Like what do you mean by that? Because I'm totally naive to this whole concept.
Yeah, so Afrofuturism is considered an epistemology or a way of knowing, as well as an artistic genre that explores the Black cultural experience through science fiction, through technology, through mysticism. And it really puts Black people at the center and makes them the storytellers of not only the past, the present, but also the future. And so that's actually what I'm very, very interested in, that as a tool for wellness and for healing in the Black community. And some of the work that I'm doing with older Black women is focused on centering the lived experiences of aging Black women as the story writers of the future, and thinking about what's in store for the future. What does society look like if racism wasn't a thing? What would that look like? How would that feel? And what needs to happen for us as a society to get there? And so that can be expressed through writing, through literature. So Octavia Butler, I don't know if you're familiar with her, like parable series.
No, that's so interesting. I'm going to read her. That's the first person you thought of that would be the good introduction for someone like me.
Yeah, Octavia Butler. It's in music. Sun Ra, he's a jazz musician. It's infiltrated all different genres, but it's like a way of knowing, but also a form of art.
Man, I wish we would have spent an hour talking about Afrofuturism. You got to come back on the podcast, and we're just going to talk about Afrofuturism. Get yourself an Afrofuturism friend, and we're just going to talk about Afrofuturism. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I do actually have one question. Have you seen that episode of Atlanta where like there's like a reparations bill that happens, and then it's like everything is flipped? Have you seen that at all?
No, but that was also something I was interested in mentioning, reparations as a form of like what could happen in the future and where the future is going.
So you got to check out when you said Afrofuturism, I was like, I didn't really know what it was that you were talking about. I was thinking about just Black Panther, which is a great movie, but anyway, point being is that Atlanta, you got to check it out. It's like got a really, everything you were talking about was in this episode. Personally, I think it's one of the best shows on television, and I'm a huge fan of that show. But anyway, next question. I feel like we could go on forever about that. So one of the things that we talked about was just specifically neurodegenerative disease. And this is something that you're interested in. What is like in your field as like a big coming up breakthrough? Like, is there anything that's coming up that's really gaining a lot of traction, a lot of buzz? Because it is a big disease. It affects a lot of people. And now we are living longer, and people want to have the same kind of brain capacity that they had when they were younger. Anything that you can talk to me about that might be something that I could check out that holds promise in giving us that kind of lifestyle?
Yes. I don't want to say it's a little bit controversial, but there's a number of clinical trials that are happening now in the field, focused on aducanumab and then donanemab, in that the thought is that they remove the beta amyloid that accumulates in the brain that leads to Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And when they look at the efficacy, I think it's minimal, to be honest, but some people are really hanging their hats on it as this could be the future, and it's showing promising results. So that's one potential avenue. But thinking about the future, I'm very hopeful that, knowing that a lot of this is based on like lifestyle and environmental things, that we can address this ourselves. Like, it may not even require medication in the future, that we can modify our risk of having dementia just by how we eat, the environments that we're in, the way we interact with one another, et cetera. And I think that that also may be a really critical thing for people moving forward in terms of reducing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is the 21st century model of healthcare. The 20th century, I feel like, was treating sickness. The 21st century, at least the people that I follow, are all about preventing sickness and maximizing lifespan, maximizing productivity, like really achieving the most that a human being can achieve. So I'm really excited and interested in that. So, one of the things that we had talked about is also just racism in general, like the systemic issues that affect different demographics. In 10 years, where do you see us? Do you see us making progress? And where do you see the idea of racism 10, 15 years from now?
I'm hoping for there to be changes at a policy level. So impacting people's access to resources. Again, thinking like higher level macro, I'm thinking changes in education. I'm thinking, changes in housing, changes in healthcare, and all of these things, I think, will have those trickle down effects on people's health. Because ultimately, that's what, like, having access to resources is what essentially people need. And it's the differential access to resources that's contributing to the disparities that we see in these diseases. So,
yeah, I think that, this is just my own personal theory, but I think that we're just due for a demographic shift, or just not a mind shift, that like I was talking to you about with this whole aliens thing that is happening in Congress right now. If we can just understand that we are literally all the same species, that, these differences are just skin deep, that's going to be like the big thing, the change in mindset. And I'm really hopeful that's going to happen. Like, growing up, you could tell me that I was going to have a Black president, and I wouldn't necessarily believe you. Like growing up, even like as a young Indian kid, like I don't think that I would have had any idea of the amount of representation that I see that's out there right now, even just for my own personal experience. And so I think things are getting better, and I think that it's just going to happen. We're not going to be able to pinpoint when it's going to happen, but it's just going to happen organically. But anyway, this was a really nice conversation. We have to have you back on, talk about more about Afrofuturism. For the listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us. Please like and subscribe, and we will see you in the future. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
We appreciate you taking part in today's episode. Take this chance to reimagine a better future by joining a community of futurists who strive for a remarkable world. Be a part of this growing network and contribute to making the world a more positive place. Visit thefuturistsociety.net and subscribe to the show so you don't miss a drop of hopeful futurism.